Well, good morning. I am so honored to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks so much for the invitation. I love to be around smart, powerful women, and so you could energize me. I was asked to talk today a little bit about the Me Too movement and kind of where do we go from here. And so I had some thoughts on that I'll share with you, but I'd love to save some time at the end for questions, to do a little Q&A about this topic or any topic that's on your mind. So I'll save a little time for that. So I think we have until 11:15, so we'll try to keep on schedule. So we all saw hashtag #MeToo, hashtag Time's Up. And it seemed that after hundreds of years, suddenly, women were speaking up and telling their stories. I think we're okay. And the remarkable thing is not only were women telling their stories, but for the first time it seemed women were being believed. The first time I kind of remember the concept of sexual harassment was Anita Hill. Remember she testified? And these members of Congress belittled and berated her as if she was making up. This was a law professor who testified. And what were the consequences? What lesson did we learn from that? The person she talked about
still there.
On the Supreme Court. Still on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas. But we've seen this change in recent years. And what's the difference? People are seeing and people are believing and people are saying we will not tolerate this deplorable behavior. Just a couple days ago, we saw finally Bill Cosby brought to justice after years and years of sexually assaulting something like more than 60 women. Even last summer, he went to trial. There was a hung jury. They retried the exact same case, and this time got a conviction. What has changed? Well, I don't know exactly, but I have some theories. One thing, I heard a recent interview with a reporter from the New Yorker who broke the big Harvey Weinstein story. And one of the things he said about what he thinks has changed is in recent years we now see women in positions of leadership in legislatures who are making the laws, women who are judges who are deciding these cases, and women in the media who are influencing thought and opinion and are the lens through which information gets conveyed to the public. And so that is one thing that is changing, women in leadership positions. And I think women in leadership positions is the key to influencing all issues that should matter to everyone, but matter particularly to women. So we're seeing a social movement. We're at the forefront of a social movement. But like all social movements, I worry that for every step forward that we make, we end up taking 2 steps back. And so we need, how do we keep that momentum going? How do we make sure that we don't have any more Anita Hills who have the courage to tell their story but are not believed? How do we influence decision makers to keep this moving forward? Hashtag what next? I think there are 3 things that we can do, all of us in this room have the power to do, to make sure that momentum keeps us moving forward and not moving back. I mean, some of us have the power to become leaders in our fields, running for public office, becoming lawmakers, becoming judges, becoming city council members, becoming leaders in our organizations. And many of you are already doing that, which is great, and I hope you'll continue to do that and encourage the women in your lives to do that, because that's the most important thing that matters in achieving progress in these issues. But there are 3 things that all of us in this room can do that are immediate and we have the power to do, and I hope you'll think about doing them. Those 3 things are: 1, becoming truth ambassadors. There is so much disinformation out there. I talk to smart, educated people who don't understand these issues about sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and we all have that power to be truth ambassadors to help spread the truth and educate our peers, all the people, our friends, families, neighbors in our circles and in our worlds. We can all support legislation that can help combat sexual harassment, sexual assault, and protect survivors. There's lots of legislation pending in our state and in other states. We can also vote for candidates who care about these issues, those who want to combat sexual assault and domestic violence and sexual harassment and consider these to be important. important issues. All right, so let's talk about each of those just a little bit. First, how can we be truth ambassadors to support each other and to make sure other people are educated? I talk to a lot of prosecutors who prosecute cases involving sexual assault and domestic violence, and they tell me what an uphill battle it is to persuade jurors in their cases because they encounter so much ignorance and lack of information. But if you can be armed with accurate information, you can be the megaphones that are out there spreading the truth. And let me tell you what I mean. There are 3 phrases that you hear so much that demonstrate a lack of understanding. Number 1, why didn't she just leave? Number 2, it's a he said, she said situation. And number 3, well, what did she expect? Every one of those phrases is all too common. We've all heard them before. We may have uttered them. But those phrases were created by men, for men, to excuse men. And if you look at who has historically been in power as legislators and as judges and as member of the media, it's been men. They create the rules of the game. I don't know that they even did it with intent to harm women or protect themselves. It's just their worldview. The worldview of powerful, wealthy, white men I tell my law students this, have influenced our entire legal tradition. And even those who are well-intentioned just had a particular view of the world that has influenced where law is today. And if we want to change it to make it work for everybody, we need to have those leaders at the table. But we can dispel some of these myths by working on those phrases. So first, that phrase, why didn't she just leave? When prosecutors try to persuade jurors that someone was the victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, they think, well, she says this all happened, but boy, it doesn't make sense because she kept living with him, or she stayed in that job. And boy, if that ever happened to me, well, I would just leave. I would get out of that situation. But, you know, that doesn't really reflect the reality that many women face. If you have no other alternative to support yourself or your children, and this is your source of financial security, you'll endure an awful lot, especially if it's to protect your children. If that's the price I have to pay to make sure my kids have food on the table, I don't like it, but I'll go back because I don't have an alternative. It may be out of fear. If I run, he will kill me, or he will kill my children. And they say statistically that it's that moment when women attempt to leave that is most dangerous, when domestic violence turns into homicide. And so much of the homicide rate is driven by domestic violence. And so threats of harm, threats of economic harm, and not just in the home, but in the workplace. If you're dealing with sexual harassment on the job, sometimes you try to roll your eyes, you try to go with it because you want to keep your job. These women in Hollywood, they were told this is the way the game is played, and if you want to be a star, baby, then here's the couch. What do they call it? The casting couch. Did she like it? Did they like it? I don't know, but if you want to be a star, this is how the game is played. Is that a deal? Maybe, how about we just change the way the game is played? And so that phrase, why didn't she just leave? There's a lot of good reasons why she didn't just leave. And so don't assume that she is lying just because she didn't leave. And so I'm asking you to help people understand that concept, that a woman isn't lying just because she didn't leave. It can be the truth that she experienced sexual harassment, sexual assault, domestic violence, and that she stayed. Those two facts are not mutually exclusive. So help be a truth ambassador to dispel that myth. All right, the second one. It's just a he said, she said situation, so we'll never know which one's telling the truth, right? I mean, how will we ever know she's not just making it up because he said it didn't happen? I mean, just put yourself in that situation. Who would make that up? To put themselves through the scrutiny, the harassment, the criticism, all the disbelief, just for kicks, just to give him a hard time, just out of vengeance, or even for money. Your life becomes ruined. I mean, I know everyone's probably heard enough about this Stormy Daniels situation, but she receives death threats, she receives all kinds of harsh statements on Twitter and on all kinds of social media, and coming forward with allegations of sexual abuse, it requires incredible courage. And so to equate these things, a woman telling the story with a man's self-interest denial is really comparing apples and oranges. They are not equal statements. And why would people think that women fabricate these stories? I think, again, it goes back to these origins of the law created by wealthy, powerful men for wealthy, powerful men who don't want to believe that these things are true about themselves or their colleagues. And in fact, in English common law, I taught criminal law last semester, and rape was part of what we discussed. A woman had to prove that she physically fought off what would otherwise be her death, that she fought to the death to prevent rape. And unless she could show that there was physical fighting, that her clothing was torn, and she had physical bruises and injuries, she could not even bring a claim for rape, because otherwise, how would we ever know? She's not just making this up. Because women, of course, had to protect their chastity, and so any allegation that she'd been involved in sexual activity of any kind was clearly just to protect her own reputation, that it must have been rape. Laws created by men to protect men. So we can be truth ambassadors by pointing out the inherent contradiction in this phrase, he said, she said. What he said does not equal or negate what she said. And let's keep that in mind. They're not equal. And the third phrase that you often hear in these situations of sexual assault is, what did she expect? As if the ways a woman dressed, or a woman who accepts an invitation to dinner with a man has given him permission to sexually assault her. When they say, what did she expect? I would hope that what she expected was that she would be treated like a human being with respect and not like a target to be conquered. I heard a story from a high school girl who served food samples at Plum Market in Ann Arbor and wore a skirt because she wanted to look professional and dress her best. Skirts these days are quite short for young women, and she's serving the free samples, and she said she couldn't, she's like 16 years old, couldn't believe how many men her father's age made suggestive comments to her and sexually harassed her while she was on the job. She was crushed, she was heartbroken that men would behave this way. She had never encountered it before in her life because the only men she had dealt with were teachers or neighbors or friends or relatives or men in church who had never treated her this way. She couldn't believe it. She was absolutely crushed. And when she talked to people about it, her boss and others, they would say things like, well, what do you expect? That's the way men behave. What do you expect? We expect better behavior. We demand better behavior. And when we tolerate phrases like, what did you expect? We need to dispel that myth, that that's okay. We expect to be treated with respect at all times. We expect to be treated like fellow human beings and not as targets or objects of sexual desire. So how do we get past these myths? Well, we'll confront the truth. And let me share with you some statistics. I serve on the board of Safe House, which is a domestic violence and sexual assault center in Ann Arbor. And there are a lot of good ones around our community. But I've had a chance to learn a little bit about some of the statistics. And knowing that I would be speaking with you here today, a week or so ago, I asked the executive director to share with me some current statistics about sexual assault. And what she sent me is just so sobering. In America, every 98 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted. Since I've been speaking to you here for the past 15 minutes or so, that's what, 10 people have been sexually assaulted. Every 98 seconds. 1 in every 3 female in America and 1 in every 6 males in America will experience sexual assault sometime in their lifetime. 1 in 3. And it is believed that sexual assault is really underreported, and so the problem is likely much higher than that. It's believed, and no one really knows, that somewhere between 15 and 35% of sexual assaults actually get reported because so many women still experience that social shaming that I don't want to report it because it'll be my fault, the way I was dressed, where I went, I had a little bit to drink, I just don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have to go to a trial and tell that story in front of people. I would rather just pretend it never happened. And so only something like 15 to 35% of all sexual assaults get reported to the police. But you know why it's so important that it do get reported is that so many sexual assaulters are serial sexual assaulters. They will go on to assault other women, and they won't be stopped unless people have the courage to step up and report it. In 80% of the cases, the survivor knows the perpetrator of the sexual assault. And so that makes it complicated too, this whole acquaintance rape situation. You know, unless someone grabs you from behind the bushes and rapes you, that's when it's not believed. Well, she went up to his room. You know, what did she expect? She did not expect to be raped. 60% of victims are women, which is really interesting because that says 40% of victims are men. So really high number of men. How many of those do you think come forward and report? I bet not many. Underreported. And on college campuses, a real epidemic. Women are college-age women more than 4 times more likely than other women to be victims of sexual assault. Really serious problem on college campuses, and we have a lot of educating to do there with our young men and our young women. And then there's statistics about the assailants. Assailants very often serial assailants. 99% of rapists are males. And in an interview project where they talk to men about their behavior without labeling it as rape or sexual assault, 15% of college men admitted to committing rape or attempted rape without realizing or recognizing they had done anything wrong when they described it. And where does that come from? I think it comes from this normalizing behavior of rape culture, which again, perpetuated by men, for men, who writes the screenplays that become the movies, like Animal House. Anybody ever see the movie Animal House? And that is all about sexual conquest, as if this is a little rite of passage for young men in college. Ha ha, isn't this hilarious? A hilarious movie. I was watching an episode of That Girl with my daughter recently. I loved That Girl as a child. Anybody remember That Girl?
Oh, yeah.
Marlo Thomas, 1960s, working girl in New York City, so exciting. So I got season 1 on DVD. I thought this would be a really fun thing to watch with my daughter. We'll watch episodes of That Girl, and we'll talk about, you know, breaking these barriers of women in the workplace together, and it would be great fun. We'd admire her smart clothing choices of the 1960s. It'd all be great fun. But we're watching an episode of That Girl, and in this episode, Anne Marie, the aspiring actress, is working with her boyfriend, Donald Hollinger, who works for a news magazine, and he's trying to get an interview with some famous conductor who is in town from some famous world symphony. And he can't get the interview, and Anne challenges him, says, I bet I can get that interview. And she does. She gets the big interview, and she's so excited, and she's gonna go get the interview. And when she gets there to do the interview, he spends the whole time chasing her around the desk. You know, so I had to explain to my 14-year-old daughter what's going on, which was very awkward. But, you know, kind of the moral of the story is, ha, poor naive Anne doesn't know how the world works. Of course, this is what would happen when she's alone in a room with the world-famous conductor. Poor Anne learned her lesson. She's so naive, and she learned a little something about the world today, now didn't she? Wow, I mean, really perpetuating this rape culture. You know, she doesn't go to the police, he doesn't get in trouble, he goes on to conduct the big symphony, and Anne has learned an important lesson about how the world works. That's the moral of the story there. So, you know, we just perpetuate so many images in television and movies and commercials and social media that perpetuates this rape culture, that men are entitled to this, and women, what did she expect when she went in there alone with him? I think she expected to get an interview and to be treated with respect, and that's not what she got, because that wasn't the way the world works. Well, if we can be truth ambassadors about how the world works and how we expect the world to work, then I think we can do something about changing these rules created by men and for men. So truth ambassadors, will all of you agree to be our truth ambassadors and help dispel some of these myths? All right, and so 2 other things that we can do to kind of keep the pressure on for what next and keep the momentum moving forward. The second thing we can do besides being truth ambassadors is to promote proposed legislation. So we've got to educate ourselves about what's going on out there and some of the bills that are before us. And you know, in Michigan, there are a number of bills pending, and if others are from other states, you can look into whether other bills are pending, but there's a number of them pending right now, and we can write our legislators, and we can call our legislators, and we can email them. Know who is your state rep, know who is your state senator, and you know, they tell me that they really respond particularly to emails. They care about getting reelected, and they know that the people who are passionate about issues are the ones who show up at the polls and who are opinion influencers among their friends. And so they pay attention to these things. I remember reading a really interesting article about when there was a big push for, you know, once President Trump got into office and how the Republicans controlled the Senate and the House, at last they were going to repeal Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. what caused them, the Republicans, to continue to vote in support of it is they got inundated from their constituents who sent emails that said, we really like the Affordable Care Act. Now that I have it, I realize how important it is. Don't take it away. It's helping me with this problem or that problem or the other problem. And so when the time came for them to repeal, as they had talked about doing for years and years and years, they decided not to do it because they were influenced by people in their community, the voters, who will decide whether they come back for their next term. And so the legislators in Michigan care about these bills. So I'll tell you just about 4 pending bills. One, there's a bill to create an address confidentiality program for survivors of domestic violence so that they can go somewhere and not be found by their abusers. Very easy, common sense one. There's another bill to amend the Child Custody Act to just modify the factors that a judge will look at in determining the best interest of the child in cases of domestic violence. Makes sense that they should consider that. There's a bill to amend the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act to prohibit housing discrimination for domestic violence victims. This is a really common problem that people don't know much about, but when you have a low-income person living and paying rent to a landlord, that landlord will sometimes demand sexual favors from the tenant with threats of putting her or her family out if she does not respond. You don't want me to raise the rent, do you? You've got a very reasonable rate here, it's very low. If you want to keep things going, you know what you need to do. And if she has no other financial alternatives, sometimes has to make that very hard choice. So that amendment would be a very good one to prohibit sexual harassment in housing. And fourth, a bill to amend the Michigan Employment Security Act to provide protection to victims of domestic violence against disqualification from receiving benefits when they quit a job. Sometimes you have to be fired from a job. If you quit a job, you don't get unemployment insurance. This says if you left for reasons of sexual harassment, you could get those benefits. So if we can support this kind of legislation, we can tell our lawmakers that we care about these issues, and that will make them care about those issues as well. And then finally, number 3 is voting. We can seize this Me Too moment with our votes at the ballot box. Some people care about gun rights. Some people care about reducing taxes, and those become their single issue vote, and lawmakers know it, and they're very sensitive to those issues. Why can't we make sexual harassment, sexual assault, domestic violence one of those wedge issues, one of those issues that matter? We tell lawmakers, this is an issue we care about, we're going to follow your record on these issues, we're going to give you a scorecard on these issues, and when we go to candidate forums, these are the questions we ask about. When we vote, these are the issues that we care about. If we care about it, then the lawmakers will care about it. And if we let them know that we don't any longer want to tolerate the kind of behavior that that young girl had to experience at Plum Market. So just in conclusion, I will say I hope you will take me up on my challenge to, number 1, become truth ambassadors. Number 2, to support legislation that helps prevent sexual assault, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. And number 3, that you will focus on supporting candidates who care about addressing these issues. And so the next time someone asks you, what's next? You can respond by telling them, #WeRoar. If we have some time, and you can ask me about what I talked about or anything else. I would be delighted to answer any questions that you may have. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your good work over the years and your continued engagement on women's issues. We have before us in Lansing about 30 bills to respond to the Larry Nassar scandal that's happened. Now it's over 300 women who have filed complaints, come forward, testified, and in some way identified themselves as his victims. As a prosecutorial, from a prosecutorial point of view, what would, in your opinion, be the most important laws to change? Because they've got 30, they're not going to do all of them. What would be the most important thing to get at to prevent this kind of abuse of people?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with all 30 of those bills, but I will tell you that there's already laws that prohibit what Larry Nassar did. It seems to me that what we really want is for someone who complains to be taken seriously, because that seems where the real problem was. if the first victims had been taken seriously, we probably could have prevented more victims from coming forward. So I would say criminalizing the failure to recognize or to stop what was going on with Larry Nassar. And right now there's some talk of criminal charges against superiors. To do that, you have to show gross negligence in office, which is a really hard thing to do and a really high standard. That's the theory that's being used in the Flint water crisis right now, and it's a very difficult standard to prove. And so I would rather see some law that requires when you get a report like this, it must advance in a certain way, and maybe really lay out what that protocol should be, so that people, even good, well-intentioned people, aren't left in a situation of, wow, what should I do? This is a really respected person, and someone's accused him of this thing. Maybe a very specific protocol. You must report, and here's who you report to. And make it easy for those people who receive that information to take it to the next level so that it can be investigated. I would say that would be the most important thing that you could do, because then if the rules are very clear, if someone fails to do that, it would be very easy to prosecute anybody who didn't comply with that rule.
And protect the complainant.
Yeah, protecting the complainant from any retribution and their privacy. Yeah, back there.
First of all, I love you on MSNBC, and I have two questions. The first is, who is your favorite host to be in?
Well, that's like asking you who's your favorite child. You can't really answer that. So let me answer it this way. I love all of them equally, but
Rachel is cool as she seems.
But I particularly enjoy being on Rachel Maddow's show, in part because she is so good. And I'll tell you, when I'm on her show, I know I really have to be on my toes, because she's not going to ask me something at a superficial level. I'm going to have to really think about something that's really challenging. But not just her, but her staff is incredibly diligent. They will call me during the day. A lot of times they'll call about a story that they end up not running. Like, hey, what do you think about this? Is this a big deal? And my guess is if they're calling me, they're calling others as well to get input on these things. But all day they're working on these stories and deciding which ones they're going to go with. And, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So there's a lot of prep that goes into her work, and she does a lot of that work herself. She writes her whole opening. They call it the A block. That first 15-minute segment, she writes it all herself. So she's super engaged. And I've had a chance to be on set with her a couple of times. And she's super smart and so curious. Even in the chit-chat time between, during a commercial, she'll be asking questions about, intel. Why do you think this happened? Why do you think that happened? Why do you think this happened? And, she's always kind of thinking about the why.
Well, on a serious note, pay equity and gender wages inequity is one of our main priorities. And in the legislature, for at least 10, if not 15 years in Michigan, there's been the same package of pay equity bills that have come forward during Equal Pay Week and still are not, no progress. So how do you see that moving forward in general?
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to get a quick fix to it, but I think the long-term solution, again, is having women in leadership positions. Why is it that jobs that are traditionally filled by women are paid less? I think it's because we value it less. And why do we value it less? Because men have valued it less. Women's work, teachers, nurses, women's work. What could be more important than being a teacher, right? So these are jobs that should be equally valued, but they're not. When we have women who are equally represented in our legislatures and on our benches and in administrative roles and executive branch of government, then I think we will see pay equity. But it may take a long time for us to get there. But I think the way we do it is to fill, let's flood the zones, flood those jobs so that we get those views represented. I also think that there's some hope that, men who have grown up in a society where they've had women as classmates and women as co-workers have far more enlightened views. I don't want to stereotype older men, because there are plenty of enlightened older men as well, but I think that when your educational experience and work experience has been to work with female colleagues whose value you see because you work with them, also have more enlightened attitudes. So that gives me hope for the future that men